Poulenc's Gloria and Janáček's Glagolitic Mass were both written at the very end of their composer's career. And in fact, I was going to say 2 years just before they died. That's not quite true. The Poulenc was performed in 1961, which is 2 years before Poulenc died. And 2 years before Janáček died, he had completed his Glagolitic Mass in 1926. But the first performance was the following year, 1927. And both works are magnificent 20th century choral edifices of a rather unique nature. Poulenc was born into the pharmaceutical family, which eventually became Roman Poulenc. He was the only son of his father and lived a rather privileged life as a young man. His mother was a pianist, and so he was very keen on music from the earliest days. And having heard the music of Debussy, which really influenced him, and also having heard The Rite of Spring, he definitely wanted to be a composer. And he was self-taught, and therefore throughout his life was quite concerned to get any help he could get, and so had piano lessons at one point with Ricardo Viñes, and also sought out the composer Charles Cachlan to have composition lessons with him. And I mentioned those things and his connection with other people because I think he relied throughout his life on the contacts he made, which introduced him to the musical world and also the artistic world. And then his partnerships with these various people were important to him, it seems. He looked for people as mentors to him. And the other big partnership, of course, which was important, was with Pierre Bernac, the baritone. And Poulenc was a fantastic pianist, and as an accompanist to Bernac and as a writer of songs for him, they travelled across Europe and the United States. So Poulenc began writing music mainly for the piano in the earliest days, and then he was taken up by Satie, who had put together this group of French composers called Les Six, and that was in imitation of the group of 5 composers in Russia called the Mighty Handful. And Les Six were known for their rather frivolous music, perhaps, and one dilemma for Poulenc throughout his life was that he could write light and frivolous music, but also serious music. And so there was a dilemma about, did we take him seriously as a composer? I think that bothered him. One of his most popular pieces, of course, was the ballet Les Biches, which was written for Diaghilev. But this thing about popular and more contemplative is very relevant when we come to the religious music. There's a mass setting from 1937 for unaccompanied choir, and then this Gloria comes late, as I say, in his career, and there's also a Stabat Mater from late in his career. He was brought up a Catholic, and my understanding was that in a way he'd slightly lost his faith. But when a great friend of his, the composer Ferru, died in a car accident, he was so moved by this that he made a visit to the Black Madonna at Rocamadour, and there he had some sort of mystical experience which brought him back to his faith, and that very much informs, I think, the Stabat Mater particularly, and also this Gloria. And the other thing I've always read about the Gloria is that Poulenc has in mind a vision of monks playing football. Apparently he saw monks playing football, and this contrast between the religious, them in their cassocks, and playing a game really plays out in the Gloria. The movements alternate between the frivolous, in a sense, and the more serious, and I think as we perform it and as we rehearse it, there are movements that sound like commedia dell'arte, that almost remind you of the circus. I think the beginning of movement number 2, with those rather comic trombones, makes you think of circus. And then in the next movement, the third movement, we are in a religious territory. We're in a church, but I think it's a church rich with incense. I can feel the sort of smoke. And actually, when we get to the very end and we sing Tu solos altissimus, I've said to the choir that it's so schmoozy that you almost feel as though you're in a cabaret situation where it isn't heavy with incense smoke, but heavy with the smoke of people smoking cigarettes. And Poulenc, because of this sort of dual nature to him and his music, it rather meant that people didn't quite understand him. I mean, if you think 1961, he's writing this diatonic music. Well, music by this time had 12-tone music thrown at it, had become very avant-garde. And so Poulenc was aware that he was a bit of an anachronism. And diatonic really means that we're in a key, and it is true that all of the moments are in particular keys. What he can do is juxtapose those keys to make life interesting. And we at one moment are in C major, let's say, and then the next movement E flat, and then back again. And that juxtaposition makes the music interesting, as does his harmony, which is always teased with extra notes which are discordant notes. And in fact that makes it quite difficult to sing, because the way he writes his notes for the singers is not always in a line this way, but sometimes this way, where you have it at quite awkward intervals. But he is a tunesmith. The wonderful thing is that he writes melody, and it's that melody that attracts us. So that Gloria, written in 1961, commissioned by the Kusevitsky Foundation in honor of Serge Kusevitsky and his wife Natalia, and was first performed in Boston and has become a staple diet of the repertory. There are 6 movements. The soprano soloist sings in 2 of them and also sings a little bit in the final movement. And one notable thing about the movements is just occasionally the music comes to a stop. And it occasionally comes to a stop with a real discord, and then there's a pause. And then we have rather static music that sounds a bit like Gregorian chant. And I do think that Poulenc was trying to convey that old style of music in amongst all this glitter of his more modern but diatonic style. The Janáček Glagolitic Mass comes out of music that he'd already written as a mass very early on, and this turns into a big orchestral choral piece that also embraces organ and organ solo. Janáček is a very late starter. It's not until he's 50 years old that his opera, his third opera, Jennifer, achieves some sort of success when it's first performed, but not until 1916, some years later, when it was performed in Prague, that people acknowledged that this was a masterpiece and Janáček was quite a force to be reckoned with. And so most of Janáček's music, and most of the music we know by him, was written in the last 10, 15 years of his life. And that does mean all the major operas, Katya Kabanova, The Macropolis Affair, The Adventures of Mr. Bruchek, The Cunning Little Vixen, The House of the Dead. They're all now staples of the repertory in the opera houses, mainly brought particularly to this country by Charles Mackerras, who was a great champion of Janáček's music. And perhaps people know the Sinfonietta by Janáček, which is also one of his late works. So it's quite remarkable that as an old man, he was writing this very vibrant music. Throughout his earlier life, he was a folklorist, collecting music and writing about music from Moravia. He was born in Hochwalde, which is now in that area of Moravia. And he was also writing about music. He was a teacher and an organ professor. And I think it's interesting that the organ crops up in this Glagolitic Mass and has a very prominent part to play. Now his music comes out of that big Bohemian tradition, so we're thinking Smetana, Dvorak, and then in fact the next one in that line is Janáček. But his music is so different, and one of the reasons it's so different is that he was obsessed with speech rhythm. It's particularly true of the operas, and is much more obvious in the operas because people are obviously singing words. But in his orchestral and instrumental music too, he wants to pick up these little cells of notes which are the rhythm of speech, and then he repeats them and he juxtaposes them. It's like a kaleidoscope, and in fact he has been called one of the first minimalists because his music has that repetitiveness about it, and we find this in the Glagolitic Mass. So it's very kaleidoscopic, it's very vibrant all the time, big colours come into your head. And the work is in 8 movements. It starts with an orchestral introduction. We think that perhaps that introduction should have been played at the end, because in fact what we've done over the recent years, or Mackerras did, was to discover earlier manuscripts to show what he perhaps thought of initially. We're going to do the version that is the traditional version, so orchestral introduction, and then we go through the works of the Mass, the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Sanctus, Agnus Dei, and after the Agnus Dei there's a big organ solo, and then we end with a final orchestral movement. And it's scored for soprano, alto, tenor and bass soloists. The alto in fact sings very little. It's the soprano and tenor who sing most prominently in it. And then the chorus mainly interject. It's a piece of, because I've said kaleidoscope, I mean the choir have that sort of feel that they do a little bit here, a little bit there, and throw their spanner in the works, as it were. And in the middle of the creed, there's another big organ solo which represents the crucifixion and the resurrection. And so it's very, very graphically dynamic music. So two composers writing at the end of their lives, very different pieces, very colourful pieces, and it should make a very spectacular concert. Huge orchestra, very big sound, nice big choir. Do come along.